Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. As the world buzzes outside, we're stepping into a quieter place, a space to reflect, to study, and to understand the darker edges of human psychology. This isn't a horror story. This is a psychological exploration. And at the center of it all is one of the most studied minds in criminal history, Ted Bundy. There's something unsettling about a person who can walk among us, blend in so well, and yet carry such destructive intent. Bundy wasn't the cartoon villain many might expect. He was charismatic, articulate, and deeply calculating. His crimes shocked the world, but it was his ability to deceive, to mask the monster beneath the surface, that left society stunned. This session isn't about glorifying violence. It's about trying to understand what happens when the human mind derails, when morality erodes, when empathy disappears. We'll look at Bundy through the lens of criminal psychology, step by step, quietly and carefully. Whether you're working, studying, or simply listening, let this be a calm, focused journey. We'll explore the patterns, the disorders, the decisions, and maybe, through this reflection, better understand the fragile threads that hold identity, sanity, and humanity together. Born in 1946 to a young, unwed mother, Ted's early life was shaped by secrecy. Raised to believe that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister, his world began on a foundation of distortion. What effect does that have on a developing mind? When reality is manipulated from day one, a child learns to question their instincts. They may even begin to distrust their own perception. His grandfather, a dominant figure in the household, was reported to be violent and controlling. The atmosphere was volatile, emotionally unpredictable. In such environments, children often adapt by developing high emotional sensitivity and control-oriented behaviors. Bundy learned early that survival meant adaptation, and part of that adaptation was learning how to wear masks. Even as a child, there were signs. He was distant, observant, occasionally cold. A story surfaced of him surrounding his aunt with knives as she slept. He seemed drawn to the macabre, not with fear, but with curiosity. In adolescence, the emotional disconnection grew. Bundy struggled with self-worth, especially in the realm of relationships. His early romantic rejections would echo throughout his later crimes. Psychologists often note this period as pivotal. Resentment took root, and the fantasy world he constructed became more detailed and more dangerous. This isn't about a boy who suddenly became a killer. It's about gradual distortion, about emotional detachment that deepened over time, about a mind that learned to imitate empathy, but never truly felt it. Ted Bundy's charm wasn't just natural. It was practiced, refined, and weaponized. He understood how people wanted to be seen and mirrored that back to them. Whether it was classmates, co-workers, or strangers on the street, Bundy had a way of adapting his personality to fit the situation. This isn't uncommon among individuals with narcissistic or antisocial personality traits. What makes Bundy remarkable is how seamlessly he did it. In criminal psychology, this adaptive social camouflage is often referred to as the mask of sanity, a persona crafted to conceal pathological intent. He studied law, volunteered at crisis centers, and attended political rallies. These weren't just hobbies. They were calculated moves, places to observe, to blend in, and to gain trust. He knew how to smile, how to make eye contact, how to seem harmless. But beneath the surface, the internal landscape was barren, void of true empathy or remorse. To many, he was intelligent and well-spoken. He used that perception as a shield. It allowed him to disarm suspicion even as he manipulated those around him. He knew the lines people wanted to hear, and he played them like an actor slipping into a role. What's unsettling isn't just what he did, but how convincingly he seemed incapable of it. We see the art of deception taken to its highest form, not loud, not theatrical, but quiet, calculated, controlled, and for Bundy, deeply effective. Long before Bundy ever acted on his darkest impulses, they lived in his imagination. Fantasies are often the breeding ground of criminal behavior, especially in serial offenders. For Bundy, fantasy wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a world where he held complete control. These fantasies became increasingly violent and specific over time, not merely about attraction or revenge, but domination, erasure, total power over another human being. In Bundy's case, the fantasy fed off rejection, insecurity, and a deep need to feel significant. Psychologically, this marks a crucial shift, a point where internal narratives begin to rewrite moral boundaries. In fantasy, there's no consequence, no judgment, just the fulfillment of power. Bundy nurtured these thoughts in silence. He didn't talk about them. He didn't display outward signs. And that's what makes this pattern so elusive. These private worlds are invisible until they manifest in reality. Forensic psychologists often speak of this bridge, the moment a fantasy is no longer enough, when it spills into action. In Bundy's case, that moment was the start of a pattern that would span years and take many lives. Understanding the role of fantasy in criminal behavior isn't about predicting who will act. It's about recognizing how isolation, resentment, and unaddressed trauma can grow into something far more dangerous when left unchecked. We peer into the silent chambers of the mind, where darkness first begins to whisper. One of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of Ted Bundy's story is his ability to lead a convincing double life. To many, he was ambitious, sociable, even charming. He had a girlfriend. He had career aspirations. He smiled at neighbors and held conversations with strangers. On the surface, he was functional, thriving even. But beneath that surface, a very different narrative was unfolding. This contrast between public persona and private pathology is a hallmark trait among certain personality disorders, particularly antisocial and narcissistic types. The outer mask serves a function. It keeps suspicion low and access high. It allows the individual to operate unnoticed, to slip through the cracks of social detection. For Bundy, the mask wasn't just a disguise, it was a lifestyle. He carefully constructed routines that allowed him to compartmentalize his darker impulses. Work in the morning, socializing at night, and in between, moments of horrific violence hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. What makes this particularly unsettling is how successful he was at it. For years, those closest to him had no idea. They might have noticed inconsistencies or strange habits, but nothing that clearly pointed to what was happening beneath. This duality raises deeper questions in psychology. How well do we really know the people around us? And how many masks do we interact with every day without ever knowing what lies behind them? Ted Bundy's first murder wasn't an outburst of violence. It was the culmination of years of simmering frustration, isolation, and fantasy. In psychological terms, it marks a critical moment, the transformation from fantasy to reality. While it's often tempting to view serial killers as inherently violent from the start, the truth is more nuanced. Bundy's first kill wasn't a random eruption of rage. It was a calculated act, meticulously planned. And in this moment, Bundy crossed a line that many criminals never do. He went from fantasizing about power to asserting it. Psychologists often speak of The threshold, the moment when an individual takes a destructive thought and turns it into an action. For Bundy, that threshold was breached in the early 1970s. His first victim, a young woman named Stephanie Brooks, represented everything Bundy resented about his failed relationships: rejection, loss, and worthlessness. To him, her death wasn't just about taking a life. It was about reclaiming control. It was a twisted, final statement about power. What's disturbing is not just the act itself, but how Bundy reflected on it afterward. He wasn't remorseful. There was no moral struggle. Instead, it was a moment of intense satisfaction, a warped sense of validation. In his mind, the power dynamics had shifted. Bundy often spoke of the compulsion he felt to kill. In psychological terms, this compulsion can be understood as an escalating need to fulfill a deep, internal need for dominance. At first, the fantasy suffices. But once the line is crossed, the desire to kill intensifies. It becomes a compulsion that is not easily contained. Once Ted Bundy crossed that line, it became clear that the act of murder was no longer just an isolated event. It was the start of a pattern. What followed was a rapid escalation in both frequency and brutality, which is characteristic of many serial killers. For Bundy, the act of killing wasn't just about the moment of power. It was about the thrill, the satisfaction, and the need to keep pushing further. Psychologically, this escalation is tied to the nature of compulsions. What starts as a singular act of violence soon becomes insufficient. Over time, the adrenaline fades, and the need for a higher degree of satisfaction intensifies. This phenomenon is called the cycle of escalation, and it's one of the most troubling aspects of serial crime. Bundy's killings began to shift from impulsive acts to calculated, ritualized events. The victims were often chosen based on appearance, which served as a method of self-validation. This selection wasn't random. It was part of a deeply ingrained psychological pattern. Each victim represented something that Bundy perceived as a challenge, an obstacle, or a way to compensate for his deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. But what makes Bundy's escalation particularly unsettling was his ability to blend these dark urges with outward normalcy. His public life continued. He went on dates, participated in social events, and presented himself as an upstanding citizen. The fact that Bundy could function in society while secretly spiraling deeper into his dark compulsions speaks to the chilling nature of his psychology. Escalation isn't just about increasing the frequency of crimes, it's also about refining methods. Bundy's killings grew more brazen over time, his confidence growing with each new act. He learned from each kill, making subtle adjustments, ensuring that his method became more efficient, more elusive. This increasing sophistication demonstrates how deeply ingrained his need for control had become. One of the most paradoxical aspects of Ted Bundy's psychology was his desperate desire for connection, paired with an equally intense need for isolation. He craved relationships, intimacy, and validation. But simultaneously, he distanced himself from those he sought to connect with. This internal conflict is common in individuals with antisocial personality disorder, where there's a deep yearning for approval and affection, but also an inability to connect in a healthy, meaningful way. In Bundy's case, his romantic relationships were often marked by tension and volatility. He sought the affection of women, but he also had a deep resentment toward them, particularly those who rejected him. His first serious relationship with Stephanie Brooks was particularly formative. Her rejection became a turning point, triggering feelings of worthlessness and betrayal that would fuel his rage for years. But despite his deep-seated resentment, Bundy still yearned for love. He engaged in relationships, had long-term girlfriends, and even expressed a desire to settle down and start a family. These desires were at odds with the dark impulses that drove him to commit violent acts. His need for intimacy often clashed with the detachment and control he needed to maintain in his role as a killer. Psychologically, this creates what's called a double bind. It's a situation where two conflicting desires exist simultaneously, leading to confusion, tension, and ultimately, a breakdown in one's ability to resolve the conflict in a healthy way. For Bundy, this tension likely contributed to his inability to form genuine, empathetic connections with others. His relationships often became one-sided. He used them to fuel his ego, to further his social image, but never truly invested emotionally. To Bundy, people, especially women, were objects to be controlled, rather than individuals to be loved or cared for. His relationships were just another mask he wore to keep the world from seeing the monster underneath. It's one of the most unsettling contradictions in Bundy's story, his choice to study law. On the surface, it appeared like a step toward a respectable future. He walked the halls of law school, case books in hand, discussing legal theory and justice. But beneath that academic pursuit was a man who had already begun violating the very principles he was studying. To those around him, he was ambitious, articulate, even admirable. He spoke of defending the innocent, of working within the system. But criminal psychologists note that for some individuals with psychopathic traits, this kind of environment isn't about moral alignment. It's about learning the rules in order to break them more effectively. Studying law gave Bundy a sharper understanding of evidence, prosecution, and how to exploit procedural gaps. He knew how investigators thought, what evidence could tie someone to a crime, what behaviors raised red flags, and how to avoid them. More than once, he used this knowledge to manipulate legal processes. Later, during his trials, he even acted as his own attorney. It wasn't about defending himself. It was about performance, control, making the courtroom his stage. This contradiction, law student and lawbreaker, illustrates how Bundy's mind thrived on duality. He lived in opposites, public versus private, intelligent versus depraved, trustworthy versus terrifying, and the more he got away with, the more invincible he felt. Bundy didn't just wear a mask. He lived through multiple versions of himself. To co-workers, he was polite and professional. To friends, witty and engaging. To strangers, helpful and non-threatening. But beneath each version was a carefully partitioned core, designed to compartmentalize his darker urges from his public self. In psychology, this fragmentation isn't unique to Bundy. Individuals with severe personality disorders often construct internal divisions to manage the tension between impulse and image. The public-facing persona can feel authentic to those around them because it's rehearsed, refined, and consistent. But it's a performance, not a personality. Bundy maintained these partitions with precision. Even when suspicions emerged, he had a way of deflecting, offering just enough charm or rationality to keep people questioning their doubts. This skill, to keep reality separate, is what allowed his crimes to span years undetected. He didn't see himself as purely evil. In interviews, he avoided responsibility, deflected blame, and even spoke of himself in the third person when referring to his crimes. The entity, he once called it. A shadow self that he couldn't, or wouldn't, fully acknowledge. This internal divide, this ability to distance oneself from one's own actions, is often what makes accountability so elusive in cases like Bundy's. It's not about denial in the typical sense. It's psychological insulation, a way of maintaining the illusion of being normal while harboring the capacity for horror. For years, Bundy operated in the shadows, calculated, patient, methodical. But over time, that control began to fray. Psychologically, this spiral is common among serial offenders. Early crimes are often spaced out, planned meticulously. But as fantasy collides with reality, a shift begins. The compulsion grows stronger. The need to recreate the high of control and domination begins to outweigh the risks. Bundy's crimes started accelerating. He began making mistakes. His movements became erratic, his methods more brazen. This wasn't just impulsivity. It was psychological unraveling. The very control he valued so deeply was becoming harder to maintain. Forensic psychologists describe this as the decompensation phase, when the psychological infrastructure holding the persona together begins to break down. Anxiety increases. The mask slips. The compulsion no longer waits for the perfect moment. It demands action. For Bundy, this meant a shift from abduction in isolated areas to sudden attacks in public places. It was no longer about perfect execution. It was about feeding a growing need. And yet, to those around him, he was still managing to maintain a facade. That duality, the outward calm and the inner chaos, became more volatile with each passing day. Bundy's first arrest in 1975 marked a turning point, not just legally, but psychologically. For the first time, the carefully built persona began to falter under pressure. At the time of his arrest, Bundy still maintained his composure. He was cooperative, confident, even charming. He believed in his ability to manipulate the system, to talk his way out. And for a while, he succeeded. But the cracks had started to show. Psychologically, this stage is significant. When control is threatened, individuals with narcissistic and antisocial traits often react not with panic, but with deeper delusion. Bundy didn't see himself as caught. He saw it as a temporary setback, a challenge to overcome. He continued to deny involvement, despite growing evidence. What stood out to professionals was his detachment, not from his actions, but from the consequences. He didn't see his arrest as the end of the line. He saw it as another performance, another chance to assert dominance, not with violence, but with intellect. He studied the law obsessively, represented himself in court, and remained fixated on image. Even behind bars, the persona remained polished. Bundy wasn't unraveling in the way many expected. He was evolving, retooling his methods of control to suit a new environment. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. Ego and fear were now in constant conflict. He wasn't just fighting the legal system. He was fighting the slow realization that the mask could no longer protect him. Ted Bundy didn't just get arrested, he escaped. Twice. These escapes weren't spontaneous acts of desperation. They were calculated, planned with patience and precision. And psychologically, they reveal something important. Bundy's deep-seated belief in his own superiority. To manipulate the legal system, to charm guards, to physically remove himself from custody. These weren't just tactical decisions. They were affirmations of control. Acts designed not just to gain freedom, but to prove he was still smarter than everyone around him. This kind of behavior aligns with grandiose narcissism, where self-image is inflated to an almost delusional degree. Bundy didn't just want to be free. He wanted to outwit, to dominate. Even when the walls were closing in, he was still playing the role of the mastermind. His second escape in particular was audacious. From a jail in Colorado, he lost weight, sawed through a ceiling, and waited until the perfect moment to vanish. What followed was a terrifying spree of violence, proof that the need for control and destruction had only intensified. But the escapes weren't just about brilliance. They were also about recklessness, about a man whose internal need to maintain power outweighed the reality of his situation. Psychologically, that kind of delusion is dangerous, not only to others, but to the individual themselves. When Ted Bundy stood trial, it wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a performance. Cameras rolled, audiences watched, and Bundy, ever the actor, stepped into the spotlight. Unlike many defendants, Bundy insisted on representing himself. This wasn't about justice, it was about control. The courtroom became his stage, the jury his audience, and the trial his script. He cross-examined witnesses, challenged procedures, and delivered statements with composure. But underneath the surface, it wasn't legal brilliance at work, it was narcissism. He wasn't trying to win the case, he was trying to win attention. Psychologists observed his behavior with deep concern. He was often unemotional, even while discussing brutal crimes. He smiled at inappropriate times. He flirted with reporters. To him, it was all part of the performance. One more chance to rewrite the narrative and present himself as the misunderstood, falsely accused intellectual. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimonies, forensic links, survivors. The truth cut through the performance, and slowly, the mask began to slip. Yet even as the trial moved toward conviction, Bundy couldn't let go of the image he'd built. He proposed to a woman in court. He continued to speak to the media. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about legacy. Bundy was no longer escaping physically, but mentally, he was still trying to run. Ted Bundy was executed on January 24th, 1989. The crowds outside cheered. Some held signs. Others wore party hats. For many, it was the end of a nightmare, the closure they had waited for. But psychologically, Bundy's story didn't end there. His case remains a cornerstone in the study of criminal behavior. Books, documentaries, academic papers, all still ask the same haunting questions. How did he hide in plain sight? Why did he do what he did? And could it ever happen again? Even in his final days, Bundy tried to control the narrative. He gave interviews. He blamed pornography. He downplayed his actions, then contradicted himself. It was always a game. One last effort to stay relevant, to hold on to power. But beneath it all was a deeply fractured mind. A man who mimicked humanity, but never embraced it. Who craved control more than connection. And who, despite the charm and confidence, died alone and empty. From a psychological lens, Bundy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That empathy can be faked. That darkness can wear a friendly face. That evil sometimes speaks calmly and smiles. But he also teaches us about the importance of vigilance, of education, of understanding the warning signs before they manifest in destruction. As this session closes, let your mind return to calm. This wasn't meant to disturb, but to reflect, to look into the complexity of one man's mind and to emerge with a deeper awareness of the human psyche. Bundy is gone, but the echo of his pathology, the questions, the patterns, the psychological insights remain, not to haunt us, but to help us understand.